Platt, and today I drink some steam. That's next to Platt's Beer of the Week. So the particular beer I have today is the steam beer. It comes to us from the fine folks at Anchor Brewing. A little background to Anchor Brewing. Anchor Brewing was founded in 1896 by a gentleman named Ernest Baruth and his son-in-law, Otto Schenkel. They had actually purchased the brewery that had been open before. I don't know if it was still open at the time, or they purchased a previously open brewery that had been open all the way back in the Gold Rush days. They purchased it in 1896 and named it Anchor Brewing. They chugged along for the first 10 years or so all right, but then in 1906 when the great earthquake hit, their brewery burnt down. It took a year to rebuild, but they reopened in 1907. Chugged along again for the next few years until Prohibition. Now, we don't know a lot about what went on in Anchor Brewing during Prohibition, but they reopened after Prohibition and started selling their famous steam beer, which we'll get into a little bit later, after Prohibition. But it wasn't too long after Prohibition that they burnt down again and were rebuilt again. Now, it's bad enough that you burnt down and rebuilt twice, had to go through Prohibition, but by the time the 50s came around, they'd gone, had been burnt down a couple times, Prohibition, the war. Things got pretty tough in the brewing business. Just for a sense of comparison, in the early part of the century, early 1900s, there's roughly 4,000 breweries in the U.S. By the 1960s, there were roughly 70-ish breweries left, and Anchor was barely holding on. A couple times they got close to bankruptcy. But luckily for them, in 1965, the right gentleman came along, and his name was Fritz Maytag. And Fritz was the right combination, too, because he was one of the heirs to the Maytag appliance fortune. Not a big brand name now, but trust me, if you were a kid in the 70s or 80s, you knew Maytag. And he was the heir. He was one of the heirs to that fortune, but he was also passionate about beer. So besides having the resources to update and modernize the brewery, he also changed their philosophy. And a lot of people will tell you that Fritz Maytag probably was the father of the craft beer movement, even before there was a craft beer movement. And I'm not necessarily going to argue with him, even though there's other claimants to that throne. In 1971, he re-released their classic steam beer, also known as a California Common beer. They were also one of the first breweries, if not the first modern American breweries, to make a porter-style beer, a barley wine, and an Indian pale ale. Remember, home brewing didn't become legal until 1979, and the craft revolution really didn't take off to the 80s. So he's doing this stuff anywhere from 10 to 20 years before anybody else is doing it. Well, Fritz wasn't satisfied with just creating one craft revolution, so in 1993 he started Anchor Distilling, one of the first craft distilleries out there. They're probably most known for their Juniper Gin. If you ever had that before, that is an Anchor product. They kept chugging along, but in 2010, Fritz decided it was time to move to greener pastures, and he sold to an investment firm. Even though today Fritz is still, I believe he has a vineyard and also a dairy, so he's still involved. He's still alive today, and he's still working, but the beer business he let go. The investment firm eventually sold Anchor Brewery to Sapporo in 2017, and now it's part of their line of beers. Speaking of which, let's talk about some of the other beers. Because they're part of a huge portfolio, they themselves don't have a huge line, but they have some really interesting beers with some really cool stories. First is their Liberty Ale, 5.6% ABV, 5.9% ABV. This beer was released in 1975, and it was the first dry hop pale ale in the U.S. Again, years before anybody's talking about dry hop and anything in the U.S. Next is their porter, 5.6% ABV. This beer was released in 1972, and it was the first American-style porter released in the modern times. Again, back in the 1800s, especially in the early 1800s, people weren't doing lagers, and the British-style beers were the popular ones back then before the German lagers came around. But this is the first modern porter. Finally is their California Lager, 4.9% ABV. This beer is based off an 1876 recipe that at the time was the first West Coast style lager. So even though Anchor doesn't have a big portfolio of beers, they do some really cool beers with some great history And again, Fritz Maytag was doing this way before the craft revolution. So we definitely thank him for that. Well, before we try this particular beer, though, let's check out the stats. So today, before we try this beer, I want to explain the beer. If you've never had a steam beer, also known as California Common, it's a unique beer. The base concept behind it is they brew this beer, they make this beer with lager yeast, but they ferment at ale temperatures. Those of you that may or may not know, lager yeast tends to ferment at cooler temperatures, gives kind of a cleaner fermentation, generally anywhere from the low to mid 40s up to the mid 50s. Ales tend to ferment mid to upper 50s all the way up to 70s. That warmer temperature, the yeast releases a little more flavor compounds. Ales tend to be a little funkier. Lagers tend to be a little cleaner. What they do here is they ferment the lager yeast, but they get it in the bottom end of the ale range. Now this beer actually dates back to the 1830s in Germany, but really became more popular here in the U.S., especially in California. Thus became known as the California Common. Now what Anchor used to do was, instead of a giant vat that would hold their wort or beer before it's fully fermented, that made it kind of tough to cool down at that kind of volume, and that's why a lot of people just brewed ales before modern refrigeration or whatever, because it was just, the temperature-wise, it was easier for them to manage than trying to manage a constantly cool temperature. What they would do is they would pump the beers up to the top of the brewery, and they pump them into shallow pans where you didn't have quite the depth and you weren't able to hold on to that heat as much. And in the afternoons when the fog would roll in, it kind of hit that beer, cool it off, you get a little steam, if it was just coming out of the boil kettle. But also too, it looked like steam was coming in, and that would cool the beer off just enough where it was close enough temperature-wise to allow that lager yeast to work. So it's kind of a hybrid beer, but cool little concept there. Well, enough about that. Let's drink some steam. All right, that's nice copper. Reminds me of Sam Adams color-wise. And again, it's a lager yeast, so be interested to see how this comes off. All right, get a little malt in the nose, not a lot of hops. Let's give it a try. Oh, that's nice. That's real nice. It is. It does have a little bit of a finish, which you don't always get with lager beers. There's a little bit of finish here. I do get a little malt on the backside. This has a medium minus body. It's not like a regular lager that's just easy drinking, you just chug her down. This does have a little body to it. I get, in the color you see there, there's from the darker malt water. I do pick up some of that flavor, but not a ton. There is a little sweetness. I'm picking up, but I don't know if I'd call this malty. I do get a slight touch of the hops toward the end. I think we're at 33 IBUs, which is mid-range. That should contribute some, hop flavor there, and I'm getting a little bit of that. Didn't get a lot of hop aroma on the nose, but this is a nice beer. I can see where this would be a big hit in San Francisco. You got a day in the 60s, maybe it's sunny. It's not cold, it's not warm. You don't necessarily want just, a 33 degrees cold adjunct lager, but you're not drinking barley wine. I can see where this really works in that, Portland, Seattle, San Francisco, type weather. Yeah, it's nice, well-executed, classic style of beer. Well, I hope you liked this video. If you did, please subscribe down below. Also, please like the video because it lets YouTube know we're putting out good content. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, or beers that you'd like me to try, please leave them in the comment section. or you can always contact me on the Twitter page. Till next time, bottoms up.